Hello and welcome to this episode of Escape into Reality. I'm your host Ahmad, and joining me is Shantanu,
Hello.
Natalia,
Hi.
and Soham.
Hello.
So today we have a really special documentary which deals with the really dark side of the sport. Like, of course, all of us have different athletes who are our favorites, and are if you're a football fan or even cricket for that matter, you have your teams who win you trophies. And generally, I feel like sports is such a feel good topic or an interest. But today we're going to delve into the darker side of this, and we're going to be talking about doping basically. And the name of the documentary is Icarus. I would want everybody to give me like a little bit about, why they should watch this documentary. So sure, I'll start. I would want everyone to watch this documentary to understand how prevalent doping generally is. And even though as we go on into this documentary and we'll see how Russia is highlighted, but doping overall is very, very common. Natalia, what would be your one reason why people should watch this documentary?
I think people should watch this documentary because it really dives into how heavy a role politics plays in sports, even though a lot of people try to pretend that it doesn't.
Okay, that's a good one. What about you, Shantanu?
I think people should watch it to understand the backstage of the sporting world. So if what you watch on TV is the front or the main stage, then this documentary gives you a good look at the backstage of what happens behind the scenes.
Okay, and what about you, Soham?
People should watch this documentary to understand how a story can evolve based on like the presence of an observer, because someone was observing this story. It went from one place to a completely different place, and I believe it probably wouldn't have gone to that place if no one had been observing from the beginning.
Yeah, that is true. I think we will get a short summary from Natalia on the whole documentary so our listeners can get a better grasp of what it's really about. Nats?
Okay, so in one sentence, essentially, the documentary exposes the Russian doping scandal of 2016, where documentarian Brian Fogel uncovers state-sponsored doping with the help of Gregory Rodchenkov, who was the head of Russia's anti-doping lab turned whistleblower.
I think that's a short and sweet, yes, a short and sweet summary. I think I'll start off with maybe doping in sports in general, and then like we can go around with our list. So this is a very, very complicated and gray area overall in sports. Like, yeah, today the testing is really good, but in this documentary, as we'll explore, like even that was cheated. In my opinion, like, humans have been taking different sort of drugs to feel better, like since the dawn of time. There's the stone day theory and all that stuff. But when it comes to sports, honestly, if you really are interested in sports, doping is generally considered not too bad as long as you don't get caught. Now, this is prevalent like everywhere. In fact, this documentary had a very nice intro where they kept showing like they showed Lance Armstrong and they showed Marion Jones, who were both like, yeah, I've never done this and never done this, and both of them like, of course, Lance Armstrong went from hero to zero almost overnight, and yeah, then they're caught for doping, and they've all like cheated tests so easily and so many times. But the larger debate around this is like, what's the big deal in this? Like, of course, like some substances are banned, but actually there are a lot of substances, especially in football, like the sport I really follow, which are not banned, and many people take them. But then sometimes they get it mixed up, and then like they're banned for a while. I think a very, very recent examples, of course, Paul Pogba, who took a drug to like help him recover from a injury, and this led to him being banned. I think it was initially a 2-year ban, and now it's been reduced to a year or so. But what about you, Natalia? What do you feel about doping in sports?
I think it's really interesting because in the documentary as well, we see how it's like a cat and mouse game where athletes will try and, to the best of their ability, evade doping tests while anti-doping agencies will come up with better and better tests to essentially catch them in the act. And I also want to get back to like the stone ape theory that you mentioned, Hamad. That sounds really interesting. And this isn't the first doping scandal that we've seen, nor will it be the last. It isn't the first state sponsored doping scandal either. And it's not even the most recent. While I was doing research for this documentary, I found out that even in the 2024 Olympics, China's doping scandal emerged, which I'll go into more detail later, but it's pretty funny, honestly, in the sense of how the world reacted to China's doping scandal versus Russia's doping scandal, where for China, it was essentially just kind of brushed under the rug and it wasn't seen as a state sponsored scandal, but the blame was laid on contaminated food, so the athletes were also let off scot free. And yeah, I feel like doping is just, it's always going to happen. It's going to, like, testing will never be as good as the substance, like the new drugs that come out. And I think Shantanu is going to touch up on this when he's talking about it, but the idea of just having enhanced Olympics where you just embrace, just go, fuck it. Let's see what a
Yeah,
human body can do on anything.
the world would be a better place, wouldn't it? Like no
It would,
medium-sized monsters. You need full-size monsters now.
exactly.
Soham, we would. What about you? What do you feel about doping in sports?
So I don't have much to say in this subtopic actually, but one thing I will say, I was also doing some research as to like past medals, how well Russia was doing before the doping scandal, because they mentioned that as like one of the reasons why wanted to cheat because they had a very bad year. I think that was in 2010. And one thing that comes up is in every Wikipedia article for every set of Olympic Games, there's always a section on doping. Like there is a controversy regarding doping in pretty much every Olympics. And then thinking about Lance Armstrong and even what we'll be talking about in this documentary, the Russian doping scandal, one thing that sort of sticks out is that it's more of complacency from the administration, whatever sports authorities are involved, than the player's own willingness to dope, as far as I can tell, at least. So I think that makes it very, I mean, doping itself is sort of, it's cheating because it makes it unfair for others who are not doping. So then, if the way you can dope legally is by having complacency in the administrative level, then that also means that there will be a whole lot of countries pretty much that are excluded from this whole cheating method of winning medals because they probably can't manage to get like someone on that level in one of the WADA labs or whatever it might be to be complacent in helping them cheat.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, I really know what you're saying, especially because when you said like in every Olympics there's a section for dopers, because people do get caught, like it's very common. And just to like reiterate my point about how common doping is, and I'll take football as an example because I love football. Between 1991 and 1997, Maradona was caught three times doping. Once was in 91, which in my opinion shouldn't have been a big deal because it was just cocaine, and that, I mean, it's banned, so that's why they banned him. But the other two times, it's a very well-known a drug called ephedrine, which is used in losing weight. So the problem with doing a lot of coke is you end up gaining a belly, and like you basically like either you go too thin or you end up like with some belly. And of course, Maradona was really famous, and like he couldn't be unfit. Of course, he's a footballer, and this is like at his prime. And 94, he was caught at a World Cup, and he was like sent out of that. And again in 97, he was caught doping. I mean, rest in peace, but this is just one of the most famous players. Another very famous doping scandal in football was actually Pep Guardiola in 2001. As his Barcelona career was coming to an end, he also like experienced a lot of pain in his joints. And he took this drug, which is legal in some places, but it's illegal in a lot of places. So it's called nandrolone. And he was found with it and he received a 4-month ban. So like while playing out his twilight in Italy, like he had a 4 month ban, and he denied it. But of course, we do know he took it. And like Rio Ferdinand, between like 2003 and 13, he was caught. Like it was so much worse for Rio because he always miss these tests. Like he just, like he knew they were gonna take the P, and like in football, the thing is you come to know when they're gonna like take your test. And he's done it twice. The first time he did in 2003, he was banned for 8 months. And the second time around, like he was already, I mean, almost gone. So he was just like given a 25,000 fine. One of the most recent ones in football is Man United's current goalkeeper, Andre Onana. Now, they say he took a substance called formicide, but it's not banned in his native country, which I'm forgetting right now. It's either the Ivory Coast or one of the African countries. Like I think it's Cameroon or Ivory Coast, but I'm not sure. But yeah, so he was very recently banned from that, and that led to him being, terminated from his contract with Ajax as well. But yeah, like this is just a small. And I mean, all of us must have heard of Lance Armstrong at this point, and there are multiple other examples. But this is so much more common than we, think, and it brings out the whole point. Like, is it fair to everyone? Because everybody's not taking these, and obviously there's an edge to it. So at this point, I would love to move on to the next topic in this podcast, which is the politics and sports aspect. How they align. They've always aligned, and we can get into that. But I want Shantanu to go first and give us his bit on this.
All right, so why do all of this? Why dope? What's the advantage of doing that for a government? Basically, when you win sports tournaments, you get two advantages. First of all, you get national pride. So whoever's in power in a government will gain legitimacy for their own power. And the second thing is you get international reputation out of it. So other people will take you more seriously. Even like I don't know how it translates. There's no direct translation from winning an Olympic medal to having more power in UN or something like that. But people take you more seriously when you're winning sports tournaments internationally. So Russia's doping program was not just about winning medals. It was a showcase of Russian supremacy on the world stage. So it's about gaining soft power. And somehow when you win medals, it's a justification of your own system of government. If something is working, that is when you're winning medals, it kind of implies that everything is working. I know there's no logical connection there, but it's a sleight of hand in logic, and a lot of people will take that as if you're winning medals, that means the government is working. The government's working means people who are in charge of the government are legitimate. That's why all these doping scandals are so common, because governments have vested interest in winning Olympic medals, beyond just the entertainment and pride factor of it. It's the fact that people in power will gain more power by winning. Yeah, we saw this directly in the documentary when the Russian doping scientist Grigory mentioned that he feels responsible for what happened in Ukraine because what he did bolstered Putin's power and approval ratings quite a bit, which gave him enough legitimacy to go and start a war, basically, like a tactically risky move.
This is, I think you touched upon a very, very beautiful point, and I think I want to expand into this one. It is not always like your Western free country. Like if we see the trends of the last 20 years, it's not your, like, sure, we had Paris Olympics this time, but before that, we had China Olympics, and we also had Russia Olympics. Like these are two very famous authoritarian states who really need these sort of competitions. I feel like to show like, yeah, the strongman's ideas of everything is working, and like we're such a great country. And this whole thing about supremacy, Shantanu, I think it really ties in well into even, Putin's worldview, which is like, yeah, Russians are a martial race, blah, blah, blah. But a very early example, this can be also the Berlin Olympics, which Hitler hosted, and he wanted the whole world to see like how good the Aryan athletes are. So I feel like it's overall like a very morale boosting kind of thing, And I love how Gregory like tied into that whole thing about like he feels responsible for Ukraine, because we clearly know there were like so many other factors at play than him helping that sort of getting them that boost. But yeah, I think it can really, really affect the morale of a nation. I think that's why like they're so interested in like getting the win. And there can be numerous examples of this, but I think I would like Soham to contribute to this aspect of it.
Yeah, I'd actually like to add on to something that both of you said. To start off with, I'd like to add on to what Hamad said about the sort of importance of doing well in a sporting event in a country where authoritarianism is prevalent. Because, I mean, you can imagine in that country's own discourse, the leader is probably always right. I mean, they're portrayed in a certain manner. But then if they can manage to get a win in an international stage, then that, I think, gives that claim of the strongman claim a little more legitimacy, that I'm not just good and respected in my own country, but my work has also translated into these people doing better on an international stage. And going back to what Shantanu said about it sort of being like a indication that the leadership is doing something right if their athletes are able to perform. My view of this was that there are certain advantages that you have on an individual level, be it like genetic or maybe something in your upbringing. But that probably ends up being the difference between like a gold medalist and a silver medalist. Ability wise, I don't think there would be much difference. I mean, they're both committed to their sport for many years. I don't think there would be much innovation in most sports that, you know, one person is doing something one way and the other person is doing something the other way. So it probably comes down to, are you biologically gifted to be better at this sport than someone else who doesn't have this? And I think if you are able to produce a athlete or a sportsman who not only has like a biological advantage, but they've also gotten all the help that they could need from their nation to get to a point where that advantage that they have on an individual level can actually be tested on the international level against someone else who's also gone through this. So I think it's a good indication of the quality of life of just subjects in a country. Because I mean, you don't know that this baby has the genetic advantage to excel in this particular sport. You're never going to know which person in your country is or has the potential to be like a world class athlete or a sportsman. So the way you produce good athletes is probably just by making sure that people in your country can prosper, and then when they prosper, then you can maybe see, oh, this person, they pop up in all the different levels of sports that we have in the country.
Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy there, Soham, because I feel like you went a little anthropology on that. But yeah, it clearly shows like I think it's like the very basics of, sports. And there's, like, I mean, I'll just give you a recent example, like Neeraj Chopra doing well in javelin for India is actually a really big deal, because like it just shows like how far India has come in like multiple ways. But like we won't get into that. But yeah, I think I agree with you. I think that it just shows like overall the country is doing well. I mean, if you can afford to, spend so much, because like these athletes cost money, like the government's supposed to spend on them. Like it shows like, yeah, this country is doing well if they can spend so much on their athletes. Surely it's not a third world country or anything. I think we can move on to the next part of it. And I would like Natalia to start with this so you can talk about the two characters in this documentary.
Okay, so the two main characters are Brian Fogel, the documentarian, and the subject of the documentary, who is Gregory Rodchenkov. So Brian's journey originally started with like a vlog of him trying to cheat doping tests set up by anti-doping agencies. It started with him being curious as to how Lance Armstrong evaded essentially every single doping test throughout his career, because he's one of the most tested athletes in history. I think he's gone through over 500 tests and he's tested clean on every single one. And the only reason we found out that Lance has been doping is because he admitted it like years later. And so it started with that, right? Of Brian working with Gregory to see how these tests can be evaded. And throughout the course of the documentary, especially once Gregory turns whistleblower, it takes a much more serious shift into state-sponsored doping and the role that politics plays in sports. And what's interesting for me is how enmeshed Brian becomes in the documentary, especially when Gregory turns whistleblower. He then relies on Brian to, one, get him out of Russia and to spread the word and like connect him to the right people and make sure that like his story becomes public instead of say relying on like the more traditional route of like talking to the FBI and everything. And yeah, it was. And the other character, Gregory Rodchenkov, he's very charismatic, he's very witty, he's very funny, and he's like a bit of a goofball, which was really like the juxtaposition of him being like a really fun chill guy versus him trying to get out of Russia and like initially working within the anti-doping lab while helping Russian athletes cheat and then later trying to get out of Russia and just essentially revealing the extent to which Russia went to help their athletes cheat. It's a wild journey. I don't think I'm doing a very good job of putting it into words. It's just you got to watch it. See,
No, no,
like,
no, Nats. I think you put it quite well, Nats.
thank
I'll add on to that. I feel like in some ways, what I loved about Brian's character was like how it, like especially when we started, it just showed him like, oh man, like such a man he is. Oh, I wish I could have been a big time cyclist. Lance was just one and
yeah.
a half years older than me. I found that really interesting. Like his idea to like do this whole doping shit just genuinely comes from that thing. Like, why am I not good enough? Like like he finishes in that, he takes part in this cycling championship, which is like the Tour de France for amateurs, and he finishes like 13th. And he's like, dude, there's got to be something. It's just a very basic instinct. Like, what can I do? Because he looks pretty fit. Brian Fogel looks pretty fit, and like he looks like a guy who would do some sort of sport. But he's just like pushing himself to the limit, and I just love how he comes into contact with Grigory. And yeah, the thing about him being a goofball is I just love how he's so casual. Like when Brian's taking the injection, he's like, you gotta do it in the buttocks. And he does the way he's saying everything, and he's like, oh, you have a dog, I have a dog, which I found is very interesting because, like, honestly, his job is like pretty dark, and we know he was in a very dark place. We'll get to that, why he was in a dark place and why he was tried. And it's pretty clear that Putin knew who this guy was, like, because he seemed so integral, and at some level, yeah, he's a turncoat and everything. I just really respect the fact that he took a stand and he was like, you know what? If the athletes are going to dope, they should get like clean substances to, goddamn use on themselves. Because it's a very sad thing. The thing in Russia is, if any one of our listeners wants to know why I'm so against the use of drugs which are not clean, is just look up this thing called crocodile. And it's this drug which is made at home in Russia. Like, there's like a bunch of ingredients. And like, it's a very common problem there. So at least him trying to keep the athletes safe was like pretty respectable in my opinion. And at the same time, like, how Brian takes a whole stand against this, and he's like, yeah, we got to expose this. So like in some ways they're very similar, Brian and Grigory. Like there's a little bit of a contrast, but I feel like the whole time, like when you see the anxiety on Gregory's face and everything, like, you should shudder. He's shuddering because, of course, we today know like of all the Russian billionaires who've been disappeared and of all those things. This man is really like, oh shit, there's a target on my back, and there was a target on his back. We'll discuss that further as well. I would love Shantanu's view on both the characters as well.
I mean, Aman, I do have to disagree with you a little bit here. I think the characters were like very different from each other. Like they contrasted really well with each other, but they were kind of very different. At least the place they started from was very different. So Brian Fogel is like this American hero type figure. He's like, I'll speak truth to power, very American, very ambitious, very fit, athletic, does things by the rules, He's very shocked when Gregory's like, just jab it anywhere. He's like, what do you mean jab it anywhere? Like, what are the
Jab it.
specific rules here?
Yeah, I see where you're coming from. And I think that's a very surface level thing. But inside, like at the core of it, like I just meant at the core of it, because we have to understand, like, of course, Brian is American, right? Like, the thing is, the kind of way, like, we come to know, like, how he's come up in that agency, right, Gregory? And, like, the fact that he rebelled, like, he was like, no, I'm gonna bring this out. That is such a huge thing. And in my opinion, that's braver than what Brian did. But I understand what you're saying. Yes, at surface they're completely separate. Like, especially like, yeah, the jabbing thing, that was pretty funny too. Yeah, continue.
Yeah, but I mean, I do still think they are quite different because Gregory is very much like a anti-hero type figure. He's morally ambiguous at best. Even when he is like I do think he took a very important stance in being like, I will protect the health of the athletes and don't use bad drugs, like use clean stuff. But at the same time, the reason he pivoted, he went to America, like the thing that he stood up against the regime, I don't know how much of it was him just taking a moral stance and how much of him was just like trying to save his own ass, because he would have been the guy
Fall
whose
guy.
throat got, yeah, he would have been the fall guy. He would most likely have been the fall guy if he hadn't done this. So it was like a little bit of a deal making type situation for him, more than it was like, I'm taking a stand against the government type situation for him.
Sorry, but I would like to add in here.
Yes, please go ahead,
The point I was trying to make in why we should watch the documentary. What you are saying, I kind of agree with Shantanu in that he probably was like, this was a survival instinct on his part to blow the whistle. And I think in that, if
Soham?
there was no camera from before on him, maybe he would have handled it differently. But I think knowing that this has already been shot, my character has already been discovered, and I can, and in a good light, like in Brian Vogel's eyes, he was not being exposed or anything. So I think he understood the opportunity he had and probably decided to, I have a choice now and I can like sort of try to right my wrongs in the past. But it probably would have been a different choice if there was no Brian Fogel in the picture, if there was no documentary being shot.
Yeah, exactly. I think I completely agree with you there. Like, he is more of a, these are the options in front of me and let me pick the best option that I see for myself here, more than it is, I will speak truth to power, I will go against a regime, I will stand for my moral principles. Although he does end up doing that, but I think he ends up doing that in like a, just it happened to be this way kind of way, rather than him going like will to power thing. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean,
I think,
the city.
yeah, I don't think he probably had like the means to speak truth to power. I mean, he is in Russia after all. They're not the same in that sense. Brian sort of has at least some, he could go to, I'm forgetting which publication they finally went with. Was it the New York Times? I think it was NYT.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was.
Yeah, like he had the option of, I have this crazy story, I have a crazy source, and let's just put it out in the public. I don't think Gregory in Russia, especially because he, like, his integrity was already built up, right? He was the head of WADA for Russia. He was already sent out as like a credible Russian person in this particular field of anti-doping. So I think for him to come out on his own in Russia itself probably would have been shot down as, oh, he's defecting for whatever reason. Maybe his career is coming to an end. Like people do that. They manipulate the narrative.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think he just set out to do this. It just happened to turn out this way. But I do think there was like a big involvement by Brian Fogel in shaping what ended up happening. And if he wasn't, things would have definitely turned out a very different way.
Yeah, for sure. Like, he would just be one of the many Russian dissidents who have been disappeared and we don't know their fate. I guess we can start with talking about filmmaking, which we sort of already have. So, great time to go into that. And I would like you to start with it.
Okay, so I mean, the filmmaking of this is, I want to say, like a little more classic documentary in terms of very like vlog style. Brian just focusing on like himself and his own journey and everything. Although they do.
That's not classic documentary, dude.
Okay, sorry, my bad. I'm comparing this to like the earlier documentary we've seen, where a lot of it is like recorded footage and a lot of it is like Brian's own recording. Although they do have, I want to say, like an interesting animated section when they talk about Gregory's past during his time in like a mental hospital. And I guess like we will talk about that later. But yeah, I also want to talk about the choices that Brian made with this in terms of like where to follow the story. And I think one of the reasons he did choose to pivot to Gregory and like the role that Gregory plays is one, it's a far more interesting topic compared to just seeing how one person can cheat the system. And also because this is something he talks about later when he goes on like the Joe Rogan podcast. He talks about how prevalent doping is in cycling, not just with Lance Armstrong, but like in the cycling world as a whole, where he says if they do take away Lance's medal and try to give it to the next clean participant, they would have to go to like the 20th person or like the 18th person because everyone dopes in cycling. And that's also why people still see Lance Armstrong as like one of the greatest cyclists in the world, because when everyone is doping, the playing field becomes somewhat level. That quote unquote level playing field, he still comes out on top, which is also why Brian kind of pivots away from that angle and towards state sponsored doping, where like Russia has such a heavy hand in of its athletes. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I guess we can have Soham give us his thoughts on the filmmaking and the film.
Yeah, I'd actually like to expand a little bit more on what Nat said. Yeah, I mean, you can clearly see that there was a point in the documentary where there was a pivot in what the documentary is about. Starts off completely different, ends completely different. But like you said, the pivot probably happened because Brian saw that this was a better, like I was saying about Gregory himself, he saw an opportunity and he took it. I think Brian also saw an opportunity and he took that because his idea for the documentary that we can see in the first half was that I've already attempted this amateur cycling race or tournament, whatever it's called. I will do it again now on drugs, and then I will have like a test done on me to show that I'm tested clean, but I was on drugs, and because I got a better result when I was on drugs. Like he was expecting this experiment to be studied as in how people can cheat, making it so that these are the ways that people probably cheat. And then you're looking at one project like this, and then all of a sudden you find out that you can go from an experiment to an actual expose where you're not drawing parallels, you're literally just saying, no, look, this happened. I'm not saying this is how it could happen, this is what did happen. And I think again it probably did help a lot for Gregory's own character, proof of character, that he was already filming with Gregory up to the point where the scandal happened. Like if you remember when he was introduced to Gregory through an American WADA director, I think. I don't know if he was the director, but he was involved with the WADA lab in America. He denied helping Brian, but then because he set him up with Gregory and the beginning, it was very, they alluded from the fact that he had actually cheated on the Olympics. Like he would just ask him, how do you know about all this? And he would just be like, let's not talk about that. Stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
it helped a lot for viewers to first see him as just like a helpful person. And because I was also wondering, how does this guy, who is supposedly a director of a WADA lab, how does this guy know so much about how to cheat, and no one is like bringing that up.
It was like an open
Then,
secret.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then, like, I think that helped as a viewer to sort of empathize a little bit with Gregory and his position. And I think the sequence that you were talking about, the animated sequence of Gregory's backstory. This is something that we actually went in deep in the previous episode of the podcast. Check that out if you haven't. But like, because it's a documentary and you don't do a studio shot, or you don't set up any footage. I think the backstory is the only time where we see this animated style. So they use that as a device to create the reality that they didn't have a footage of. And they did get sort of a little more creative than they had to. I mean, that sequence where he's talking about being in the mental ward or mental, I don't even know if you can call it a hospital or an asylum, but he starts talking about how he was being dosed with like just psychoactive substances. And the animation, it was already in an animation style, but the style changed a lot when he started talking about being on drugs. And obviously this is a documentary about different kinds of drugs, but they are talking about drugs. And funnily enough, they were also playing a Pink Floyd song at that sequence. While we are on the subject, I would just like to say, if you haven't seen the documentary yet and you are interested in watching it, be a little cautious in the beginning if you are like me and have like a weird, I don't know if I can call it a fear or a phobia, but if you have a thing about needles, in the beginning, he's just like constantly jabbing himself, and he's not just talking about it, which would also be a little bit of a deal breaker for me, but he's actually showing the jabbing. And literally, I have not seen the first 10 minutes of the documentary. I was just listening to it. And honestly,
It's
like,
constant.
it took me a while to actually get past that part. Like, I sat down to watch the documentary. I could only stomach like 2-3 minutes. I put it off for another day. Again, you start. And I kept thinking that this is going to be like the whole documentary. So I was also getting worried, am I going to be even able to watch this in time? But it does change like quite soon. I don't even think the first whole half is about this. So if you are also put off by needles, just listen for a little bit. Don't watch.
Yeah, that's a good trigger warning that I should have, because this was my recommendation for this episode. And the
I mean,
reason
I don't think you would have known, right? Like,
yeah,
it's not as if it was in the trailer or anything.
there's no
Yeah, yeah.
real like trigger warning or anything in terms of like what this episode talks about, like death or suicide or whatever. There's nothing really for this episode
I
has
don't think it's
needle.
that intensive of a trigger. I mean, it's very personal for me. Like, it's
Yeah,
been a
yeah,
thing.
yeah.
So I would like, if there are any other people like that listening, I guess I can help you out. But I don't think it's big enough that it actually deserves a trigger warning.
I mean, yeah, it's like a part of his life, and it's actually a whole thing about trying to discredit him because the Russians are like, "Oh, do you know this defector was in a mental institution?" And they
Yeah.
said in Russian and everything. But
Yeah.
yeah, I love how they're like, it's his criminal past. It's literally like doping. They were like benefiting off him, and then they wanted to get to him. But yeah, I guess Shantanu, what is your opinion on the filmmaking?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a few interesting things about this film. As both Nirali and Soham mentioned, the most important thing is probably the pivot that happens in the film, which is he set out to do one thing and then he goes on to film something completely different. And the interesting choice that Brian Fogel makes is that once he's completed filming, he decided to show the pivot in the film, like he kept it, which is why, like when Natalia said it's a classical documentary, I would disagree with that because it's very much a modern documentary where the filmmaker is inside the documentary, plays a fundamental role in what happens in the film. So it does feel like a combination of a vlog and a documentary where he's just going about doing his thing. And the camera's presence is felt throughout. You can see him film stuff. You can see him talk about filming stuff and setting up some shots and stuff like that as well. So you are privy to the filmmaker making the film while you're watching the film, while like old school documentaries, which are still prevalent. Like, like if you watch something like Planet Earth, there's a narrator who's not even been to where the thing has been shot, and he's just talking about the stuff. And there's a subject, and there's that you are analyzing, and the camera is not part of the subject or not involved. They are detached. They don't want to get involved. Whereas here, like the filmmaker is fully involved in the story. He's in fact fundamental part of the story. So that's, I think, the most important part of this film. It's like, first of all, like most important part of the filmmaking aspect of this film, which is how much Brian Fogel is involved in the film himself. And the second thing is that he chose to keep the pivot in, and you don't know what's gonna happen next. You are discovering things as Brian Fogel is discovering things. So there's no narrative structure like that, it's just happening to him and it's happening to you. So those are the two things.
All right,
Um,
then. I guess. Wait, has somebody left us? Oh, it doesn't matter. Yes, we can move on to my opinion, important part of this documentary about the outcome of all of these law organizations you mentioned, like WADA and stuff. Nats, can you let us know if there's been any update to these WADA guidelines?
Yeah, so interestingly, WADA as a regulatory authority has no real power to enforce the rules that they try to pass, because it's highly dependent on like the country like enforcing these rules. And as we all know, no country will actively choose to give its athletes a disadvantage. And so, for example, in after they enforced the Russian ban, athletes were still allowed to enter the Olympics, just like as individual athletes, not under like the Russian flag. And I also want to talk about the 2024 scandal, which I mentioned earlier, where Chinese athletes, about 23 Chinese athletes, were tested positive for a drug called trimetazidine, also known as TMZ. And the hilarious thing is, these Chinese athletes were tested positive while training. And this drug, TMZ, is prescription heart medication. So, Shantanu, you might know more about this. It's essentially it's medication that strengthens your heart. So these athletes were training on this drug, and when they tested positive, China essentially said that the reason they tested positive was because this medication was found in the food that the athletes consumed at the hotel they were staying at. So they essentially said the food is contaminated. It's not the athlete's fault. There was no like active decision to take this drug. The reason this is a little bullshit is because it's not a steroid that's given to animals. It's prescription medication for humans. And there's no explanation as to how the food is contaminated or how the kitchen was contaminated. It's just, oh, they found this in the food, so it's not the athlete's fault. So they're still gonna continue. And China did really well in the Olympics. Like they got gold medals in swimming. Nothing really happened. They just continued and it worked out really well for China. And the hilarious thing now is the US was furious at this and tried to launch their own investigation, and WADA is now quote unquote unfairly caught between two political superpowers in this like geopolitical tension between US and China. And essentially WADA's trying to stay out of this, which brings it all back into like the heavy hand that politics plays in sports, where the US is essentially saying China's cheating, China's saying no, we're not, WADA saying I don't want to be caught in the middle of this. And yeah, I guess like at the end of the day, WADA doesn't have much power at all. They did release a statement saying that they're going to try and work closer with local law enforcement authorities, which again will turn out to be bullshit, because what local
What
law
are they gonna do?
what are they gonna do exactly? Like that's just trying to pass the buck down to like the local level and essentially say if like we can't find any proof of like cheating because it's up to the country. So yeah, at the end of the day, WADA can't really do anything.
I just want to, like, the first time I heard in the documentary, I don't know who said it, but someone called, so WADA stands for World Anti-Doping Agency, and someone actually referred to it as, we are referring to it as just WADA. And my first thought was, like, knowing what this documentary is about, not having seen all of it, my first thought was just, what a load of crap, like everyone doping is happening and they still have the audacity to call themselves anti-doping agency.
Yeah, it's become a joke at this point. Like there's no real attempt to,
Exactly. Like,
yeah.
I just love how they were like, yeah, we have to keep politics out of it. So yeah, they're going to be allowed to play. And I still remember the 2018 World Cup. Russia played so well, and it was like, how is this country?
And they were the hosts of that cup.
They did
In fact,
surprisingly well, huh?
yeah,
Yeah, I
they
remember the
managed.
first match itself. That was like 5-0 against Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, dude, and the guy who scored 2 goals in that, Denis Cheryshev, he was tested for doping multiple times after the report came out, and there are quite a few people who are like, they're suspected of. I mean, that win against Spain, it was just so weird because like Spain was playing so well that tournament. But lest we get into this other broad topic, I would like everybody to give.
Just Ahmad, just one more
Yeah, yeah, please.
implication thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
The one more interesting thing that has happened recently is, as Natalia mentioned before, is this new thing that's coming out soon. It's called the Enhanced Olympics.
Yes.
And there's this guy, Peter Thiel, he's financing it. And they
Mhm.
sort of just decided, okay, cool, athletes cheat. Let's see what if we just allow everybody to take drugs, like, and we just, like, the rule is you can't have adverse effects health wise over a longer period of time, but you can dope, and let's see what happens. And that's supposed to come out within like the next year or two, so that'll be an interesting thing to watch. Even their advertising is someone beating Usain Bolt's record in a 100-meter dash, because they obviously took drugs, and they are faster than Usain Bolt because they beat him because they're doped. But like, it's quite interesting, and it'll be an interesting thing to see if something like that takes off.
Yeah,
I think it
I really
adds
think
like
it will.
I think it adds a new layer to like the training aspect of athletes, because now it's not just the individual athlete's responsibility. There are doctors who are like, I mean, obviously, normally also doctors would be keeping an eye on the athlete's vitals. But now the doctors are also trying to figure out what kind of a substance, can I give this
Yeah,
person, this particular person,
yeah,
sell it, whatever
it's a
their
bit
shortcomings are.
yeah, it's a bit like F1 where it's the driver but also the car.
Yeah, exactly. That's the sort of analogy I was thinking of. Because they're also, yeah, it's not just about the racer. Now the car is also being involved.
Yeah, so it's like engineering competition as well. Like, it's a
Yeah.
bioengineering competition as well. It's not just
Yeah, exactly.
sports
I mean,
anymore. It was interesting.
even with the regular Olympics, you have like athlete training camps in China, right? Where like very, very young children are essentially like they spend their lives training. So I feel like enhanced Olympics is like the next step of just let's see what the human body can do. And it's really interesting. They're also offering like a $1 million bonus if you break world records, which yeah, sure, I think we should do it. I think we should just go all in and see what like the physical body is capable of.
I mean, this
mean-
could very well be the beginning of the boys, like what?
Yeah.
We might just be
It
starting
started
that
out in
off.
the Olympics.
Yeah, we just wanted, and now we have a guy who can just run from Russia to America. I
Dude,
know there is a sea between.
there is stuff like genetic engineering to produce
Mhm.
the Olympic athletes and stuff like that as well. There's like a bunch of stories around it.
You can buy those
Before
genetic
we
things from
move
China.
on, though,
Yeah.
so Nats spoke about like updates to WADA's guidelines, or if WADA is changing their procedures. I just wanted to add a little bit about, sorry, some guy nearby. So this was like a very big expose, and I'm pretty sure they couldn't like just let it slide. Like, we can't just be like, yeah, okay, this happened. They had to show some repercussion of it. And when the sort of verdict was made, the outcome was that Russia had a 4-year ban on participating in the Olympics as a country. So the athletes could still participate, but they would not be representing Russia, and there would be no Russian flag at the Olympics. Like Russia was completely unrepresented. And so I was watching, like, I think it was a Sky News report on this where they spoke to a few athletes about what this means for their career. And a lot of the athletes, what they were hinting at, so the behind the scenes agreement was that if you want to appear as an independent athlete, you also, like, you are sort of denouncing Russia and their involvement in this whole thing. Like, you couldn't just participate without also condemning Russia's actions in the past. So the athletes were faced with the choice of, do I go to this Olympics as independent, or do I wait for the next one? Because maybe if I condemn Russia today, they might not pick me again 4 years from now. And this happened again when the Ukraine war started, the second one, not the one in 16, but the recent one. When that conflict started again, the ban has been extended now.
Yeah,
And now
that,
when the I just
I
want to
s-
finish this. So now when
yeah,
the athletes are asked as to, what do you think about, because now, like, the doping thing was sort of out of the question now since the conflict started. And now the athletes were saying pretty much the same thing, that, we have to make this decision, because again, you have to condemn Russia's action in Ukraine if you want to appear in the Olympics as a independent athlete. And one thing that the athletes kept mentioning was, maybe we should keep politics out of the sport, because we are not politicians, we are just sportsmen. And I thought that was a little, I don't know, like, they didn't really think things through when they said that. Because on one hand, Grigory himself is saying that the Olympics was probably why Putin was confident enough to invade Ukraine in 2016. And also, I mean, the whole reason the Olympics even happen is because of politics being involved. I mean, no one would spend so much money on it if there was no other benefit for having, like, this grand sports ceremony once every 4 years. I mean, there's so much money spent on sports.
yeah. I mean, I also want to mention that after that ban, unlike the Olympics, Euro in the 2020 Euro, like Russia was just straight up kicked out of it. Like the war and all hadn't even started. They just fucking kicked them out because they were like, if you're not following the protocols, then everybody's dirty, right? And I feel like that was a better punishment. They were not even going to feature for the 22 World Cup anyway, but they went in ahead and invaded Ukraine. So, I mean, they were already banned from it. So that was a repercussion. If I'm not wrong, I think they've been stripped of at least 50 medals at this point, which they won unfairly, of course. That's why they're stripped of it. And I guess we can all move on to, everybody can share one line about how the documentary changed our perspective in regarding to doping and, I guess, dissent in some way. Shantanu, why don't you start?
I mean, for me, it was about how much sports is connected to politics and how much political organizations are both involved and invested in sports. And this documentary kind of revealed the reasons behind it, which was, I think, the most enlightening thing about this documentary.
I think that's a very good point. What about you, Nats?
For me, I think it revealed just how prevalent doping is in
Lovely.
almost every sport. Because as I was watching Brian Fogel talk about this documentary on the podcast and stuff, he also talked about how Gregory revealed that every single athlete was doping except the figure skaters. And that was because the drugs they were using would bulk up the figure skaters, and figure skaters need to be very like lean and slender. So yeah, essentially every sport had doped athletes except figure skaters. So I guess if you want to watch a sport without any doping, figure skating is the only thing left untouched.
I
Out.
think I would rather
Out.
watch the end.
Yeah, I'm out.
In enhanced
Soham, what
Olympics,
did
it would just be, oh, sorry.
Soham, what did you learn from this documentary?
So I would actually have answered what Shantanu said, because I mean, I always knew politics and sports were, like, hand in hand, but I hadn't thought about it that much, as to what the outcome of a sporting event could possibly lead to. And I mean, the Ukraine thing is just one thing, but I think it can happen on smaller levels as well. So that was like
I think, yeah.
we think in a different way than I had thought about it before. So in that sense, it was interesting.
What I learned was, I think I learned a lot from Brian Fogel in the sense that you got to keep trying. If you haven't doped yet, dope now. Just kidding. But honestly, I think what I really learned from the documentary was, of course, how common doping is. I mean, I kind of already knew that, but more importantly, the nuances around it. Like, see, like we know how the Russian state was exposed for running this ring, but there's so many other, not these state sponsored rings. I think that's very unique to Russia, but like there are many of our favorite athletes are like doping. So like it just brings the whole credibility of any sport where this sort of breaks out, and you really start to think like, how good is this person? And I think like it instills this level of I don't know if I'm saying the right word, but like you're questioning more often than not, like how some athletes are like so good. So I guess it just changed my perspective on like even like the best. Mostly it's the best for doping, I guess, because like if you didn't make it, you probably didn't dope.
Yeah, I mean, even tied to like whether, like your point, Hamad, on how honest these athletes are, and bringing it to like the 2024 doping scandal and US's investigation, because Michael Phelps not testified, like he went to Congress and he was like, this is patently unfair because apparently US athletes are tested very thoroughly and very regularly to the point where their test, like they just have like no privacy and they're expected to be able to give like pints and pints of blood and urine, and you have someone watching you pee to make sure it's your pee, your urine and not someone else's. And it's, I think this also brings out like the amount of effort that each country is willing to put in to make sure their athletes are quote unquote honest. And when it comes to like an international playing field, you can't really tell as to like who is honestly playing and who isn't. And yeah, it just brings into question like, is it worth watching if half these athletes are like doped up and playing on like a completely different level compared to the other half? Raise a lot of interesting questions.
Thanks for listening, everybody. It was another great episode, and we would love it if you would subscribe to our podcast. And also, if you have any documentary recommendations, please do leave them in the comments below. Until next time, this is your co host, Hamad. Bye.
Bye.
See you.
Bye.